All right, we're back at it today, and we're going to talk about the nature and effects of World War I on the United States now that we are actually declaring war. First and foremost, the United States has to actually build a military. We've got to mobilize for the war effort. After the war was declared, the United States had a very small military, and so we needed to build what would be called the American Expeditionary Force. Before World War I, the United States had around 125,000 soldiers in our army, but this would explode to nearly 5 million by the end of the war. And much of this growth came through a selective service draft. However, many Americans did volunteer for the war effort. The United States also had to fund the war effort, and this would be done largely through the issuing of what were called Liberty and Victory loans, or victory bonds, or Liberty bonds, which would be sold to help finance this war. Taxes in the United States were also dramatically increased to fund the war effort, with the highest tax bracket being raised to 75% of one's top earnings. With the United States joining the war in the final year, military manufacturing was light compared to their European allies, but would grow throughout the war effort. And the United States government would establish the War Industries Board to try to coordinate the financing and manufacturing needed for this war. Now, with regard to agriculture in the war, future American President Herbert Hoover was appointed to be the food administrator. And this would use federal powers to set wheat prices higher to encourage more production. The government would also purchase agriculture products to maintain supplies for the war effort. An organization was created to volunteer conservation from Americans, including what you see above me here, wheatless Mondays, wheatless Wednesdays, meatless Tuesdays, even a porkless Saturday, to try to encourage Americans to conserve the food we're eating here to leave more for the war effort. During the course of the war, food production in the United States would increase over 50%, and farmers' incomes would grow dramatically as well. And this is going to have an important part to play for a Great Depression that will be right around the corner. Now, with regard to labor and the war effort, the federal government established the National War Labor Board to try to coordinate relationships between labor and management to settle disputes and make sure factories kept operating during the war. Wages were often set and higher standards for employment or encouraged, and this gave a lot of growth to labor unions during the war effort, which grew by 15%. Some women would enter the workforce during World War I, but this would be a far lower number than what will be seen in the Second World War. The United States propaganda machine also evolved during this war with the creation of the Committee on Public Information, established in 1917, with the goal of uniting Americans behind the war effort. And so posters and films were created to support America's involvement in the war. This also encouraged the sale of Liberty bonds to fund the war. And unofficially, vocabulary changes entered American culture, with Liberty cabbage replacing sauerkraut and Liberty sausage replacing frankfurters. Even the German measles would lose out and become Liberty measles through the course of the war. On the home front as well, the federal government would pass and the president would sign into law two laws known as the Espionage and Sedition Acts, which would create fines and possible imprisonment for activities that were seen as supporting the enemy or being against the United States during the course of the war. The Sedition Act of 1918, for example, said that written attacks on the government or the opposition to the sale of war bonds even could result in punishment. This would lead to many arrests across the United States, including a man named Charles Schenck, who was arrested for distributing anti-draft publications and leaflets. This eventually made it all the way to the Supreme Court, which ruled that Schenck could be found accountable here as his actions presented a clear and present danger to the United States that was engaged in a war at the time. Now, later Supreme Court cases would overturn this decision, but we definitely see the First World War seeing some strikes against American civil liberties with the Espionage and Sedition Acts. During the war, African Americans also played an important role, with many conflicted about supporting the war and bringing democracy to Europe while living in a segregated Jim Crow era America. Now, the American military was still segregated itself, though the government did try to promote the encouragement of African Americans to join the military. Hundreds of thousands of African Americans would volunteer for military service, and they served abroad, often finding more racial harmony in France than they ever experienced in the United States, which that helped contribute to a growing movement for civil rights in the United States. Now, this is also taking place at a time when hundreds of thousands of African Americans are going to start to move to northern industrial cities that are ramping up production for the war effort. And this would become the first stage of what becomes known as the Great Migration in the United States. The Black Press, the collection of African American publications and journals that existed throughout the United States, was also heavily watched and often stifled by the Espionage and Sedition Acts. Now, the military role of the United States is relatively small compared to the duration of the war and what Europeans are going through, but still very important for the ultimate victory of the Allies. The first American expeditionary force of doughboys, led by General John J. Pershing, would get to France as early as June of 1917, just a couple months after the declaration. But this was small and largely a symbolic number. The first major American offensive in the war would not take place until the next year, in May of 1918, at the Battle of Cantigny in France. At Belleau Wood in June, American forces would help stop a German offensive at the Marne River. Now, this was a part of that spring offensive of the German military, their final push. And by the end of the war, from September to November, over 1 million American soldiers would take part in the Meuse-Argonne offensive. This is the pushback of German forces, which ultimately leads to a break in German defenses and the German high command moving towards an armistice in November. In less than 1 year of actual combat, Americans lost over 100,000 war dead and over 200,000 wounded. Now, with the dead, more than half of those actually died from non-combat sickness due to the Spanish flu, with less than 50,000 actually dying in combat-related deaths. We'll see you next time.